Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. We are still in chapter 3, the second half of Chaos. The chapter is called The Golden Penetrators. Gross. This little section is called The Paper Trail Begins. Let's get into it. I was doing shoe leather reporting on a 30-year-old story. The memories I heard were rife with the omissions, contradictions, and embroidery that come with the passage of time. I would interview people and then rush to the library to fact check as best I could. What they told me in books about the case, histories of LA, biographies of organized crime figures, old news clippings, and more. But if I wanted to report this story with veracity, I needed contemporaneous documentary evidence, the paperwork. When sources like Charles Eastman would mention having journals, I would beg them to find them, often calling back repeatedly until they did. But first and foremost, I wanted police reports and trial transcripts. The case had been the longest and costliest in California history, and Bugliosi said that the transcript numbered more than 1 million pages. Wow. Where was that? Could I have access to it? The LAPD told me they'd destroyed all their investigative reports. They'd retained some files, but they weren't about to release them to me. How could they have trashed their records of the most infamous case in the history of the city? I didn't believe it. I asked them to put it in writing, and they did, stating in an official letter that a thorough and proper search produced no records. All the evidence had been destroyed. Not to get conspiratorial, but it kind of reminds me of the moon landing, like all of their footage and stuff got destroyed. Well, I'm gonna take my tinfoil hat off, but it's interesting. Why? I turned to unofficial channels. I'd heard about a researcher named Bill Nelson, an older man who was obsessed with the murders. He'd self-published several books about the case and had a lot of original police reports. Nelson was purportedly a pretty strange guy. He stalked former members of the family and relatives of the victims, trying to befriend them so he could interview them. That does sound strange. I wouldn't want to try to befriend any of those people. No, thank you. He'd become close to Sharon Tate's mother, Doris, even traveling with her to Paris to visit Roman Polanski. But they'd had some falling out before her death in 1992. I looked at Nelson's website, mansonmurders.com. The fact that he had one at all was still something of a novelty in 1999. Yeah, websites. I mean, most people did not have websites in 1999. Regularly updated with accounts of his crusades, his page included an index of crime scene photos, police documents, and interviews, most of which were for sale. But there was also plenty to suggest his instability. A retired evangelical minister, Nelson boasted of a close and personal relationship with Jesus Christ. He bragged about having attended the United States Secret Service Academy, where his design for the annual class ring was still in use. His exposés of former family members were vitriolic and often ad hominem. He published photographs of some of their children, having stalked them at their homes and school. What a creeper. Like, I don't care how good the scoop is. You don't stalk people and their kids. What is wrong with these people? But I had to admit that he was a thorough researcher, and I was at a loss as to how I could come by these documents otherwise. I swallowed my pride and sent him an email. We met for coffee at a Denny's in Costa Mesa one afternoon. Across the table, Nelson looked like a retired accountant, mid-60s, balding, his silver hair neatly combed on the sides. He dressed conservatively in a button-down shirt and khakis. I paid him $40 for copies of the homicide investigation reports, unredacted and numbering almost 100 pages. He'd gotten these from Earl Deemer, the cop whose interview with Billy Doyle I discussed earlier. Deemer conducted most of the polygraphs for the Tate investigation and had copied all the police reports, photos, and audio tapes related to the case. I'm surprised he got access to all that stuff, to be honest. How Nelson persuaded him to part with all this stuff was a mystery. Some said he bought the files, others that he stole them. He didn't want to tell me, that much was clear. Deemer had since died, and what was left of his records went to Mike McGann, a retired homicide detective who'd been the lead investigator on the Tate team. McGann lived in Idaho now. Nelson gave me his number. Like Ed Sanders and others, Nelson believed that certain elements of the law enforcement knew that the Tate LaBianca murders were planned, or they knew who were behind them. They'd been unable to act because it would have exposed their secret intelligence gathering operations. That's the thing, you start to wonder, like, well, if they knew, why wouldn't they have gone for it? It was because they were hiding other things. Nelson had watched nearly every televised interview Manson had ever given. He felt that Manson never lies, he just withholds information. Must he never lie? Come on. But Manson would never tell the truth about the murders. It would involve snitching, and there was no greater transgression in a criminal's mind. Hearing all this at Denny's made my head hurt, but I felt I had to indulge Nelson, in spite of how far-fetched his theories sounded. Some of them resonated with me long after I pulled away from the restaurant that day. Well, all the intelligence gathering stuff he's starting to hear that over and over and over, and really making him question the real story at this point. Back home, I put on some coffee and pulled out the sheaf of papers I'd just bought, feeling somewhere between eager and anxious. As explained in Helter Skelter, the homicide investigation progress reports were essentially internal summaries. They outlined the detectives' various leads and efforts to break the case, presenting the investigation in all its disarray without Bugliosi's streamlining. So maybe it's just kind of a bunch of notes. The 33 pages on the Tate murders, first homicide investigation progress report, dated to the end of August 1969. Much of them was workmanlike, describing the activities of the victims in the days leading to their deaths, the chronology of the discovery of the bodies, the recovery of evidence, and so on. When the investigators speculated on the hows and whys, I sat up a bit. They focused on the possibility that Billy Doyle, Charles Taycott, and others had initiated a vengeful massacre after Frykowski welched on a drug deal. The second homicide investigation progress report came 6 weeks later, describing the battery of polygraphs and interrogations through which investigators concluded they had not found the killers yet. I'd expected to see names like Altobelli's and Melcher's everywhere in the two Tate reports, but I was wrong. Melcher wasn't mentioned once. Now that's kind of like they call it the dog that wasn't barking, right? Like there should be plenty of mention of his name. I mean, as we've heard already. And Altobelli was only referenced in passing. If investigators had looked into the possibility that the man who'd owned the house or its most recent previous occupant had anything to do with the murders, there was no sign of their efforts here. As intriguing as these reports were, they were kind of a letdown, and other reporters had already gotten them. If I wanted something new, really new, I'd have to keep pressing. I decided to call Mike McGann, the retired cop who lived in Idaho. If Nelson was right, he'd have a stockpile of documents that dwarfed the collection in my hands. Do cops regularly just keep documents on cases they're working? That seems weird, huh? Everything in Vince Bugliosi's book is wrong, McGann told me on the phone. I was the lead investigator on the case. Bugliosi didn't solve it. Nobody trusted him. McGann spoke in gruff sentences, sometimes no more than a word or two, always a breath away from hanging up on me. I wanted to know more, but McGann, like others close to the case, expected to be compensated for his time, and even more so for his papers. He had the records, he told me, but they were available only for a price. That effectively shut down the conversation. I kept calling McGann, who was willing to tolerate my curiosity to a point. I wanted to know about Melcher, Wilson, Jacobson, and Altobelli. What had they told the cops and when? What about Carol Wilson and Carol Jacobson, Greg's wife? McGann said he hadn't gone through the files in years, but he'd look if he had a chance. 2 months later, during our 6th conversation, he still hadn't agreed to show me anything for free. McGann said that he had 190 written summaries of the interviews by the Tate detectives. Some were only half a page long, most were a page or two. A few were longer. There were no interviews of Melcher, Jacobson, Wilson, or Altobelli. Again, dogs that are not barking. But there were interviews with Carol Jacobson and Carol Wilson. He pulled out the letter dated August 15th, 1969, and started to read a portion over the phone. But soon he stopped and raised his voice. "Are you taping this? I'm not going to go for that." I turned off the tape, but he refused to read anymore. Before he totally lost patience, I asked if he could tell me one last thing, the date of the Carol Jacobson interview. He leafed through the pages. August 10th, he said. Oh, I believe the murders were on August 8th, so that was a very fresh interview. The day after the bodies were discovered. Okay, so they happened on the 8th. They were discovered on the 9th, so this would have been the next day. That meant that both wives, Jacobson's and Wilson's, the two Carols, as Altobelli called them, had spoken to police within a week of the murders. Why not their husbands? Yeah, that doesn't make sense, does it? And why not Melcher or Altobelli, given their close ties to the Cielo home? Where were those interviews? Probably, or in the shredder. I don't think shredders existed at that time, but you know what I mean. Okay, revisiting Cielo Drive. One night, after taking Altobelli out to dinner, I drove him home, as I always did. He totaled his car after our first meeting. He was certain someone had run him off the road as a warning to stop speaking to me. And since then, I've become his de facto chauffeur. I hope he's getting some good information out of him at least. Our evenings together usually ran to 6 or 8 hours, with Altobelli requesting impromptu stops at the supermarket or at a bar for a nightcap. We were close to Benedict Canyon that night, so I took us back to that valley that way. I used to drive this way back to Cielo, he said, beginning to reminisce about the happiest period of my life. When I asked if he'd mind if we drove up to the house, he said, sure, why not? I sensed some reluctance in his answer. Cresting the final hill, we proceeded in silence down the narrow road, stopping at the gated entrance to what had once been 150 Cielo Drive. The house had been razed in 1994. Erected in its place was Via Bella, an Italianate mansion of concrete and marble, behind a tall, ostentatious gate that concealed most of it from the street. I want to see what numbers they put on my mailbox, Rudy said, suddenly irritated. Where is my mailbox? I maneuvered the car beside it. 166, Altobelli said, reading the numbers. They had it changed. His voice cracked. We had such a great view, he said, gazing from my passenger seat at the sliver of space beyond the gate. It's all so cold looking now. My house was so warm and cozy. Apparently it was sacred, and apparently Sharon Tate called it her love house. Some little fun facts there. His voice broke again, and his breathing was shallow, like he was gasping for air. Let's go, he said after a long pause. Back up now, he said. When we were already halfway down Cielo, he shouted again, just go. We drove back to his apartment in silence. At home, with about a half-dozen stray cats greeting him outside, Altobelli perked up, kneeling down to pet each one and calling them all by name. Inviting me in, he apologized for what happened back at Cielo. It was the first time he'd returned since he left 10 years before. I lived in that house 25 years, 4 months, and 38 hours, he said. Now he lived in a converted garage in a neighborhood known for its gang activity. Hanging over his desk was a framed photo of the house from the mid-60s and a watercolor painting of the front gate. Also framed was a letter from Bugliosi commending him for his testimony at the trial. Rifling through old snapshots on his desk, he handed me fading photographs of celebrities, all taken at the Cielo Drive home. The last one was of Terry Melcher, passed out on top of the same desk Altobelli was presently seated at. Melcher's hand gripped an empty bottle of liquor. Booze and pills, Altobelli said. The photo was taken when Melcher was staying with him at the house after the murders. Yeah, he was a mess at that point. I mean, who wouldn't be, I guess, but... In November of that year, when the police told Altobelli that Manson was responsible for the murders, the first thing he did was call the two Carols. I said because of their husbands, I was struck with all of this. I was left in the lurch. They knew what was happening at the house. Terry was the instigator of the whole thing. Altobelli seemed to be toying with the idea of letting me in on something bigger. He did this a lot. A seemingly offhand remark would complicate his entire portrait of the period. Terry talked about Manson all the time, he said. Yeah, he acted like he didn't really know him, only saw him 3 times, but definitely, according to this, not true. He thought he was wonderful. He asked me to manage him, but hadn't Terry said he wanted nothing to do with him? Terry stalked Manson. They thought they had Jesus Christ. Yikes. I don't know. I do not understand how people fell into his into his tricks. Later, when I got transcripts of the trials, I'd see that Altobelli wasn't just embroidering. On the stand, he said that Melcher, along with Wilson and Jacobson, had talked to me on many occasions about Mr. Manson and his philosophy, his way of living, and how groovy it was. Tellingly, in his own testimony, Melcher acted as if he hardly knew the man behind his groovy philosophy. Presented with a photo of Manson, he told a grand jury, "I don't know him, but I think I've seen him at Dennis Wilson's house." Okay, so one person saying he thought he was Christ, and another saying, and he's saying, "Oh, I don't know. I don't really know him. I thought I saw him once or twice." Come on. Later, he revised his story, still stressing that he'd met Manson no more than 3 times. In other words, even at the time, Melcher's and Altobelli's stories weren't straight. Thinking of my talk with Mike McGann, I asked Altobelli if detectives had interviewed him after the murders. Of course they had, he said. He even remembered when, and had been on the date of the Tate and Sebring funerals at his lawyer's office. At the trial, he testified to the same thing. Following his lawyer's instructions, he reminded me he hadn't said anything to the police about Manson. I told Altobelli that McGann had said there was no record of his interview. He was as baffled as I was. So all these interviews and stuff, and they're just poof, gone from the record. I was going to say a paragraph or two back when it said they thought they had Jesus Christ. And I was thinking, gosh, how did anyone fall for this guy, his antics? But obviously a lot of people did. And I was watching an interview with this actor, Danny Trejo, however you say it. And he said he was in prison with Charles Manson, or jail, county jail, something like that. And Manson would hypnotize the other inmates. Can you even imagine, like, having that story that you were hypnotized by Manson? Gross. Gives me the shivers. No. It might surprise you. With McGann stonewalling me, I paid a visit to Stephen Kay of the LADA's office, thinking he might be able to point me toward more documents. Kay had helped Bugliosi prosecute the case in 1970, joining the trial midway through, a career-making turn for the young lawyer. In ensuing decades, Kay had served as the government's most prominent voice against Manson and the family, appearing at their parole hearings to argue against their release. He was, after Bugliosi, the legal world's leading expert on the family. I met Kay at his office in Long Beach. When I turned the subject to Melcher, he volunteered something else I'd never heard. Manson and Watson attended a party at the Cielo house when Terry and Candace Bergen were living there, he said. He was confident about this. The information first came out during the trial for Tex Watson, who had been tried separately from the other family members. Kay had confirmed it with Greg Jacobson. He thought it was another reason that Manson had chosen the Cielo house for the murders. When he sent Watson and the girls there, he noted that Tex knows the layout of the place. And yet Melcher, in his testimony, had said that he never once saw Watson inside his house. So what is he hiding? What is he hiding? Melcher doesn't want to have anything to do with this. You'll never get to talk to Melcher or Candace Bergen, Kay told me. Kay didn't believe that the LAPD had really destroyed their files on the case. For one thing, he said Bugliosi had borrowed what he needed to write Helter Skelter, and then conveniently never returned anything. How do you get away with that? I do not understand. Bugliosi had seen earlier than anyone that the Manson trial was going to be his meal ticket. He took the ethically dubious step of installing his writing partner, Kurt Gentry, in the courtroom every day to watch the proceedings in real time. Gentry was working on the book that would become Helter Skelter before anyone was even convicted. The sensationalism only inflamed Bugliosi's hubris. At one point, he grabbed Kay's arm in the courtroom and said to him, "Steve, aren't I great? Do you know anyone as great as me?" Oh my gosh, what a narcissist, huh? And Bugliosi was still dining out, literally, on Manson stories. The case continued to earn him a handsome income in royalties and public speaking appearances. I was curious about those who hadn't made out so well, people still living in the shadow of these crimes, who had been broken by the tumult of the late 60s. They'd have no vested interest in preserving the official narrative. Through a series of LA attorneys, I tracked down Irving Kanarek. speaking of people whose lives went to heck in a handbasket after this. Manson's defense attorney. I'd been warned that his was a sad story, but I wasn't prepared for the dire straits I'd find him in. Kenarick comes across as a ridiculous figure in Helter Skelter. That is true. Bugliosi portrays him as an erratic, bombastic blowhard whose obstructionist tactics earned him harsh criticism from every corner of the legal world. The book devotes many pages to his history of indiscretions in the courtroom. By the available evidence, Bugliosi wasn't exaggerating here. Kenarick really was a reviled, difficult lawyer, and his conduct in the Manson case bore this out. According to legend, Manson wanted the worst trial lawyer in Los Angeles. Someone told him that Kenarick was his man. Why would you want the worst attorney? That's weird. I mean, I know Manson did supposedly, I guess he was kind of his own attorney, but they made him have this guy too. He objected 9 times during Bugliosi's opening statement alone. By day 3, he'd racked up an impressive 200 objections. The judge jailed him twice for contempt. Bugliosi conceded that Kenarick could be effective, even eloquent at moments, but this didn't stop him from calling Kenarick, in court and in Helter Skelter, the Toscanini of tedium. I don't know what that means. Do you guys? Toscanini? I met this Toscanini standing on the sidewalk in Newport Beach. It was 80 degrees out, but he shuffled up in an oversized winter coat and threadbare sneakers, lugging a battered briefcase held together with twine. This guy was a somewhat prominent attorney, and this is what it's come down to. Newspapers and plastic bags were poking out. Short and stooped, Kenarick had an unkempt, patchy gray beard. His hands and face were streaked with dirt, as if he hadn't bathed for weeks. There were sores on his body, and he was missing most of his teeth. What in the world happened to this guy? I guess maybe when you defend people like Charles Manson, something clicks wrong in your brain. I don't know. Let's see if it tells us. Once Kenarick learned I had a car, he asked me to drive him to a Barnes & Noble, where the cashier handed him a copy of the LA Times and sent him on his way. It was the previous day's paper, he told me. That's why he didn't have to pay for it. Then we got lunch outside at Santa Monica Seafood, a relatively upscale chain. Kenarick struck me as sharp but eccentric. His explosive volume led diners at 2 other tables to relocate indoors. He'd shout things like, "Manson didn't kill anyone. He's the one who should have gotten immunity." Or all Charlie wanted to do was screw girls. He didn't know they were going to murder those people. Can you imagine being at lunch and hearing somebody shouting this craziness? Although, maybe he wasn't paying too much attention to it. I know when I was in nursing school, my friends and I, this is a tangent, guys, but it's funny. There was a Subway across the street from our college, and we'd go there for our lunch break and we'd study, but nursing is kind of a gruesome thing to study. It can be, at least. And we would clear out a Subway in a snap of our fingers. But we didn't really realize we were doing it until we looked around and we're like, oh, where did everybody go? This kind of reminds me of that. Most of his diatribes took on Bugliosi, for whom he had endless epithets. Liar, cheat, crook, con man, adulterer, stalker, woman beater, son of a bitch. And worse, he shouted, causing another table to flee. An indicted perjurer who used his influence to be acquitted during his trial. When I asked if Kenarick was paid to defend Manson, he smiled wryly and said that he was, but the confidentiality prevented him from revealing by whom. That's interesting. So wait, I would imagine that, why wouldn't he get paid? He's a lawyer, he's defending someone. Public defenders still get compensated for their work, right? It would be big news, he said. It might surprise you. If Kenarick had a benefactor, another lawyer told me later, that white knight wasn't generous. Kenarick apparently spent most of the trial living out of his car and sleeping in the press room at the courthouse. Over the 10 years prior to our meeting, Kenarick had discovered his wife was cheating on him. He'd wandered into traffic and been struck by a car. He'd suffered a nervous breakdown and spent time in a mental institution. He'd lost his law firm, his license to practice, and his life savings. That is sad. Now he was living on Social Security at a motel in Costa Mesa, the next town over. After lunch, I offered to drive him back. He took me up on it. but could I take him on a few more stops before we parted ways? A few more stops turned into 2 harrowing hours in my 1988 Acura. Kennard screamed at me for missing turns that he told me to take just as we were passing them. We drove in circles around Orange County until, to my horror, he announced he decided to accompany me back to LA, which meant 2 more hours in the car with him during rush hour traffic. Almost as soon as we pulled onto the freeway, he was ranting again. When he said again that Bugliosi was an indicted perjurer, I asked him to explain. Belittling me for not having done my homework, Kennard said that during the Manson trial, someone had leaked the rumor about Manson's celebrity hit list to a journalist named Bill Farr, who'd published it in violation of the court's gag order. The hit list scoop must have come from one of the lawyers on the case. They were the only ones with access to it. With the jury out of the courtroom, the judge made the attorneys swear under oath that they hadn't slipped the information to Farr, who'd refused to reveal his source. All 6 attorneys denied having done it. After the trial, the judge, still suspicious, impaneled a grand jury to investigate the incident. They indicted 2 of the attorneys for lying. One was Day Shin, Susan Atkins' defense attorney. The other was Bugliosi. Read the grand jury transcript, Kennard shouted. The state decided to prosecute the case. But if Bugliosi was convicted of perjury, it would jeopardize the verdicts in the Manson trial, and the DA's office couldn't stand for that. They got the judge to dismiss the charges on a technicality. They colluded, that is, to protect the convictions from the longest, most expensive criminal trial in U.S. history. It was a sweetheart deal, don't you see? Kennard shouted. His spittle sprang in my face. Disgusting. It wasn't mentioned in Helter Skelter, I said. Of course it wasn't. Neither was the fact that Bugliosi stalked his milkman and beat up his mistress. I should look up those cases too, both of which he said have been taken care of because of Bugliosi's political clout. He's a criminal, he shouted, and dangerous too. So yeah, that is an interesting aside. Supposedly, I may have mentioned it already, but yeah, he thought his wife had slept with the milkman and didn't think one of the kids was his, and he really stalked this milkman's family and like took their kids to buy toys and stuff. This was Bugliosi. And O'Neill kind of surmises that that's why he was chosen to do this case, because they had that to hang over his head, basically. And so if he didn't do things the way that someone wanted him to do, then, they could destroy his career, basically, with that knowledge of his stalking of the milkman and beating up a mistress who I believe was pregnant. I thought Kennard was unstable, so I didn't put much stock in his stories. I was relieved when we got to Hollywood. I wouldn't have to endure any more of his delusions. As he gathered his things and got out, I started to worry about him. It had occurred to me that he might have been homeless. I offered him some cash, but he waved it away, asking me instead to promise that I'd look into his claims about Bugliosi. I watched them disappear into the crowd on the low-rent end of Hollywood Boulevard. Later that year, when my relationship with Bugliosi began to sour, I'd find that everything he said was true. Coda. I'm not the oracle. So I don't know. I didn't know what Coda meant, but apparently it's like conclusion. I've been sending progress reports to Premiere. The magazine's editor-in-chief was hooked on the story. He was as invested as I was. In the middle of May 1999, the editors agreed to extend my deadline a second time. That meant the piece would be too late for the anniversary of the murders. But it didn't matter, they told me, as long as I could deliver something big. I was relieved, at least in the short term. In the long term, I was starting to feel the pressure of having to produce something mind-blowing. I had to get it right, and to do that, I had to push harder on my sources, find new ones, and most critically, find more of the documents generated during the investigation. Having heard so often that Terry Melcher would never talk to me, I knew one thing I could do to set my story apart: get Terry Melcher to talk to me. I'd gotten his number, but I didn't want to use it until I was sure I had some good questions to ask him. I figured I'd only get one shot. I finally called him in early June. He was articulate and from the start irritable and distrustful. I get so many damn calls about this crap from all over the world, he said. I don't know anything about this shit. Altobelli called me for the first time in 10 or 15 years a few days ago and told me the story of the bullets. I don't know if that's real, but so what? What are you gonna do? At the time of the murders, I asked, did you suspect Manson? I had no idea whatsoever. I used to audition 3 or 4 bands a week. They all look the same. They all look like the cast of Hair. How many times did you meet Manson? Once, very briefly, at Dennis Wilson's house, and a second time at the ranch. But I've spoken to people who claim that you knew them a lot better. I really didn't, Melcher said. Why had he moved out of the Cielo house so suddenly? It was totally ridiculous to pin that on his fear of Manson, he said. He still blamed his housekeeper, Ruth Simmons, which I think is the most ridiculous excuse ever. It's just hard to believe that someone as powerful as you would move out of his house rather than fire the maid, I said. It's really true. I just couldn't figure out what else to do. Plus, his mom had vacated their Malibu beach house, and he thought it was a good idea to live there to prevent it from falling into disrepair. Next, I probed his friendship with Dennis Wilson. How could he dodge the fact that both of them, plus Greg Jacobson, should have suspected Manson as soon as they learned of the murders? Melcher said that his friendship with Wilson had dissolved around that time, as Wilson became increasingly reticent. The rumor was that Wilson knew that they were killing people, Melcher said. He was so freaked out, he just didn't want to live anymore. He was afraid, and he thought he should have gone to the authorities, but he didn't. And then the rest of it happened. So he was in some way just tremendously guilty. Now, I don't know that that's true. And that guilt, doesn't it apply to you too, I asked. I don't think so. Christ, if they'd wanted to get me, all my doors were wide open that whole summer. After the murders, he'd heard that Wilson met with Bugliosi and all the DAs in the state of California in one great big room, and that Wilson had managed to eke out only one sentence about the family. Well, we hung around and smoked a little pot and sang some songs, period. That was it. That was his entire statement. Why would Vince settle for that, I asked. I don't know, he thought. Just put him on the stand. But he didn't put him on the stand, I said. This was something I've been thinking about a lot. Dennis Wilson would have been a star witness, since he'd known Manson so well, and he'd seen his violent tendencies. If he didn't want to testify, Bugliosi could have subpoenaed him. He did it to force testimony from plenty of others. Why not Wilson? Well, they thought he was nuts, and by that time he was, Melcher said. He had a hard time separating reality from fantasy, seriously. He had inventions. He tried to sell me once a new invention that was the size of a cigarette box. So actual inventions, like, Edison inventions. An anti-gravity device. You keep it in your glove compartment, but when you get in a traffic jam, you just turn it on and fly right over the other cars. He really thought it worked. Okay, maybe he did fry his brain, but if he was hanging out with Manson, that's not too far outside of the realm of possibility, right? I had more questions, but I could feel him growing impatient. I'm not the oracle about this thing, Melcher said. I just know that it was incredible pain in the ass. That pain would continue. Listening back to my tape of the call, I'd realized that I caught Melcher in a lie, one that implicated Bugliosi. It gave me my best shot yet at proving that both of them were involved in a cover-up. That is the end of chapter 3, guys. I wonder what the cover-up is. I don't know. I hope it's getting interesting for you guys. I've read ahead several chapters. I've read the whole book in the past, but it's been a little while. But I'm like, oh, it's starting to get interesting, but I am a few chapters ahead. So I hope you guys are still interested. What are you thinking so far? Have any of you actually read Helter Skelter and, heard what the official narrative is? Because it's pretty interesting that, something that nobody really questioned, even though reading it now, it sounds so crazy, like race wars and, I don't know, killing someone to scare someone else, even though it wasn't really clear that would happen. I don't know. What do you guys think? How are you enjoying this so far? I really hope you are. Yeah, I find it fascinating. It's a little gruesome, but just that time in history with all the CIA stuff, the hippie stuff, the war stuff, all the crazy stuff that the CIA was doing, that Cold War stuff. Fascinating to me. I hope you guys think so too. All right, you guys take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one. Bye.